Europe led the way in everything. In 1945, when the guns fell silent, the world was bankrupt and exhausted. Across 3 decades in which empires crumbled, new players with new ideologies emerged. A world centuries in the making had been dismantled by a world war. On June 13th, 1939, British Ambassador Sir Neville Henderson wrote from Berlin, "I feel intuitively that the Germans are getting at Stalin." So they sent British Admiral Sir Reginald Drax to Moscow in the slowest possible manner. And for Stalin, sending a D-list diplomat, combined with the recent signing of the Munique pact, was the nail in the coffin.
With the Munique agreement, in which they are left out, they're not even consulted, they begin to become disillusioned with the Western powers, Britain and France.
So Stalin began to form new alliances. After the snub at Munich, Stalin was open to new partnerships. Vyacheslav Molotov, the new Soviet Minister for Foreign Affairs, was the man for the job.
Molotov, he's a very hard-line foreign minister, and he pursues very much the ambitions of Stalin.
While the English Admiral Drax finally made it to Moscow, so did the German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop. And within days, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed.
Why Stalin agreed to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is kinda obvious. Because in essence, it's a response to appeasement and the signing of the Munich Pact.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was very attractive. The pact allowed Stalin to annex eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania and Czechoslovakia, pushing Russia's boundary almost as far westward as it had ever been. But this came at a cost. The advance put the Red Army far from its frontier fortifications.
And so signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact really was a way of delaying the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Ideally, so that the Germans would exhaust themselves against the British and give then the Soviets the same opportunity that the British wanted. Let them exhaust themselves, and then we can roll into Germany and take control of Europe.
On September 1st, 1939, the Germans used action rather than words to announce the start of the Second World War in Europe. In the first week of September, German forces invaded Poland from 3 sides. 2 weeks later, as agreed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's secret protocols, the Red Army invaded across the 4th border. Poland was a poor country, whose national budget was less than that of the city of Berlin. But she had allies. Hitler made a speech in the Reichstag in which he offered peace. France rejected Hitler's proposal on October 10th. Britain on the 12th. What they rejected was an invitation to sign off on a new Europe, in which German conquests were accepted and ratified. Czechoslovakia, Memel, and Poland. Having been rebuffed in his peace burlesque, Hitler was for action. On October 25th, 1939, Hitler set the date for an invasion through Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Due to bad weather, it was repeatedly postponed. And though war had been declared in September of 1939, there was no actual fighting between the Nazis and the Allies until April 1940. These months became known as the Phony War.
And the French actually call it the drôle de guerre, the funny war, the strange war. And the reason for that title, whether it be phony or funny, is it was a war which wasn't a war. There wasn't really fighting going on.
But after more than 6 months of biding their time and building up their resources, the Phony War came to an end with Hitler's invasion of Norway in April 1940. The Allied action at Norway was a disastrous and, at times, comical catalogue of fumbling, bungling, and bickering.
In a way, the Norway failure was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back after many years of appeasement and failed policies to Germany, and it was finally the point that for many people was too much.
The only plus for the Allies was the damage inflicted on the German Navy, which lost almost half of its destroyer force, severely compromising its ability to support a cross-channel invasion of Britain. The Norwegian campaign had another lasting effect on the war.
And it was the Norway debacle that really made Churchill prime minister, because when it became clear that the Norway mission was a complete disaster, a lot of unhappiness with Neville Chamberlain's administration started coming out.
And Winston Churchill was ready to step into the prime minister's shoes.
There's probably never been a moment in which someone becomes prime minister of Great Britain, or maybe any other country, facing such an absolutely dire crisis. But if ever there was a man for the hour, that was the man for that hour.
But there would be no pause for the new prime minister. A French military attaché had wired the information that the German attack will occur between May 8th and May 10th. The main effort will be made on Sedan. The tip-off was ignored. And besides, the French were quite certain their line of fortifications were impenetrable. The Maginot Line, an array of defenses that France built along its border with Germany in the 1930s, was designed to prevent an invasion. It included dozens of fortresses, underground bunkers, minefields, and gun batteries.
The French feel that they're protected behind the Maginot Line. When the war breaks out, they will send troops into Belgium and they'll beat the Germans. They won't have to have large numbers of troops protecting the frontier with Germany because of the Maginot Line.
But this was World War II, and the Germans were waging a different kind of conflict.
To put it very simply, the Germans attack in the place where the French had not expected them to attack.
With the Norwegian campaign a success for the Germans, they continued their march across Western Europe. But on paper, they were the underdogs. The German army, at 135 divisions containing 2.7 million men, faced a superior enemy. Britain, France, and Belgium in alliance deployed 130 divisions containing 3.7 million men. Less than 1,000 of France's almost 3,000 tanks were organized in armored divisions. And German tank strength was concentrated in 10 panzer divisions.
The Germans used their armored formations independently, not as a support weapon for the infantry, but as an independent formation that could fight the battles independently.
In World War II, the Panzer changed the style of warfare.
And they didn't expect this at all. They expected a sort of repeat of the First World War. A sort of trench warfare with not very much movement.
It'd be easy for the Germans to try and come through Belgium, but they'll never come through the Ardennes, because the Ardennes is forested, it's hilly, and it's crossed by the River Meuse, which is supposedly impregnable, a river with very steep banks. How on earth are the Germans going to get tanks across the River Meuse?
The first German units reached the Meuse at 2 p.m. on May 12th. Most of the units arriving had yet to see an enemy soldier. Then on the 13th, Germany brought its massive aerial superiority to bear on the reservist units defending Sedan.
The Germans launched their Stuka bombers with these piercing sirens, which traumatized these troops, who are not cowards particularly, they're just reservist troops, slightly older men who just nothing had prepared them for it. So they are understandably demoralized.
The Battle of Sedan was an Allied trouncing. By May 13th, the Meuse had been crossed and Allied lines had been breached. The Dutch surrendered on the 14th, and Brussels fell on the 17th. In only 7 days, the Germans had advanced 320 kilometers and divided the Allied armies. And Paris was on the horizon. When on May 15th, the French Prime Minister, Paul Renault, phoned Churchill to say, "We are beaten," the British Prime Minister's response was, "Surely it can't have happened so soon." As early as May 19th, British GHQ staff were weighing up the options for retreat to the coast and evacuation through French and Belgian channel ports. Lord Gort, the British commander, had his eyes set on Dunkirk.
After the German breakthrough in the Ardennes, the British forces became increasingly exposed to the German onslaught. And by May the 25th, 15 days after the offensive had begun, he had to make the difficult decision to protect his force against potential annihilation by the Germans.
Group Van Kleist, comprising 3 panzer divisions, stopped less than 25 kilometers from Dunkirk, where they were ordered to halt.
At first sight, the British Expeditionary Force seemed doomed as the Germans closed in on the port of Dunkirk. On the beaches, which of course has become the famous story of evacuation, nearly 100,000 men managed to clamber into small boats, which were then sailed out to larger vessels, and the men transferred to those for evacuation to Britain. Nearly 1/3 men were evacuated from Dunkirk, an extraordinary achievement.
Dunkirk was a disaster for the British Army, which was obliged to abandon most of its gear. But there was a euphoria in Britain as the public learnt of the successful evacuation efforts. Churchill was quick to reply, "We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations." At this time, Churchill began mobilizing his most potent weapon of World War II, his wartime speeches.
"We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender."
Only days after this speech was broadcast, Mussolini, believing the Allies were struggling, declared war on France and Britain at a time when his army was smaller and less well-equipped than it had been in 1915.
In the lead-up, though, to June of 1940, when Italy does enter the war, the feeling was that Germany was being so successful that the war would in fact be concluded within a matter of months. If that were the case, Italy had really very little to lose and a huge amount to gain. So this was really the desire for fascist Italy, was to get a place at the winner's table, to engage in a short war that would be quickly victorious, and then to move on.
Back in France on June 14th, 1940, General Bogislav von Studnitz led the 87th Infantry Division through the almost deserted streets of Paris.
The German army defeats the French army in 6 weeks, and then occupies Paris on June 14th, 1940. This is Hitler's greatest single military victory. And it also marks the high point of his popularity in Germany.
Marshal Pétain, hero of Verdun, replaced Renault and pushed the signing of an armistice.
On the 16th of June 1940, Pétain becomes the new head of the government, and on the 17th of June 1940, Pétain makes a speech saying, "It's all over, we now need to sign an armistice with Germany."
Pétain's signing of the armistice and subsequent surrender came as a shock to many.
And so there's this terrible panic among the French population. So Pétain sort of presents himself as the father figure, the man who will put an end to this terrible population wave, which is called the Exodus, this great exodus of population from one part to the other. He said, "I will now bring the war to an end."
And so he does. But Hitler makes it as humiliating as possible. On June 22nd, the armistice was signed at Compiègne in dining car 2419D.
Hitler made a real point that when France asked for an armistice in June of 1940, that the ceremony at which that armistice would be signed would be at exactly the spot where Germany had signed the armistice in November of 1918 to end the First World War, and even that the very railway car in which that 1918 armistice had been signed would be got out of a museum where it was being kept and brought to the very spot at Compiègne, and the French would be made to come there, and Hitler really wanted to savor this moment of absolute vengeance in exactly this spot, in exactly this railway car.
Under Hitler's orders, the carriage was destroyed in 1945. There would be no third humiliation.
The armistice makes possible the setting up of a new authoritarian regime which installs itself at the town of Vichy. The Germans are in the north, in Paris. The unoccupied zone is in the south. And obviously this is only prelude to a full peace treaty. And when the French sign an armistice, they think, oh, well, the armistice will be there for 6 weeks, 2 months. then Britain will be defeated, there'll be a full peace treaty, we might lose some territory and so on, but then it'll all be over.
The fall of France meant so much for its people, but on an economic level, it was a disaster. It removed a major industrial economy from the Allied cause and grafted it onto that of the Axis.
In the armistice, the French agreed to pay approximately half of the French state revenues to pay for the occupying forces. This was really, really important. As the war progressed, the Germans needed more and more resources. So what they took from France increased systematically. On average, throughout the war, approximately a third of everything produced in France went to Germany.
The fall of France also put her Atlantic ports in German hands, halving the distance U-boats had to travel to reach the Atlantic Ocean. Stalin, according to Khrushchev, cursed the French and the English. He would now need to accelerate rearmament and consolidate his borders. How come they allowed Hitler to thrash them, he railed. In response, Stalin annexed the Baltic states, as had been agreed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And the Red Army entered Bessarabia and the Bukovina in Romania. The absorption of the Baltic states was, as Goebbels said, our price for Russia's neutrality. On June 24th, as Hitler took in the sights of Paris, he was asked about a victory parade. "I am not in the mood for a victory parade," he said. "We aren't at the end yet." A new France, given the name l'État français, came into existence on July 12th.
So somebody who refuses to accept the idea of an armistice is General de Gaulle. He managed to get to England on the 17th of June, the day that Pétain makes his speech calling for an armistice. Winston Churchill allows him to speak on the BBC on the 18th of June, and he makes a subsequently famous speech.
La défaite française.
This war has not been settled by the Battle of France, he said. This is a world war. Winston Churchill concurred. The Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. In mid-July, the Luftwaffe dropped leaflets over England titled "A Last Appeal to Reason." They offered a statement by Hitler in which he said, "I see no reason why this war must go on." But Churchill understood Nazi ideology, and he could not come to terms. And in that resolve, he was supported by the British people, the RAF, and the incomparable Royal Navy.
So the Royal Navy was much larger than the German Navy. So the Germans needed to win air supremacy over the skies of England before they can ever think of executing an amphibious assault on British soil.
The Luftwaffe was the answer, and the Battle of Britain would be fought in the skies. But the defenders had a few tricks up their sleeve.
And an incredible duel takes place between the Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force over the English Channel and over parts of England. Unfortunately for the British had advanced air force, and it had, very importantly, a highly developed ground-based, radar-based defense system, which was crucial to beating the Luftwaffe.
But radar could only hold off the enemy for so long. On August 24th, bombs rained down on London. The RAF retaliated with an 80-plus bomber raid on Berlin, which did little damage and caused no fatalities. But an infuriated Hitler changed tactics. The Luftwaffe would target the English people. From the beginning of September, the blitz against Britain grew in intensity. On the 15th, large air raids hit London, Southampton, Bristol, Cardiff, Liverpool, and Manchester. But the Luftwaffe's fleet was not equipped for the job. Its feared Stuka dive bomber was a failure against RAF fighters and had to be withdrawn. On September 17th, the invasion of Britain was postponed indefinitely. Hitler had to shift focus to the antics of his ally, Mussolini. Führer, we are on the march. Victorious Italian troops crossed the Greco-Albanian frontier at dawn today. So Benito Mussolini said in a message to Adolf Hitler on October 28, 1940.
Well, I think you need to relate the Italian invasion of Greece to Italy's abysmal performance in the war up to that point. So for propaganda purposes, I think they needed a success, a distraction.
Mussolini felt that he had to match the man who had gone from protege to master. So he sent his troops into Greece, where, in late November, they were disastrously defeated.
Italy invaded Greece, and that kind of has an avalanche effect. It brings into effect the British guarantee to Greece. The British are left carrying their guarantee alone, and they have to provide the troops from their forces in Egypt, which has a knock-on effect on their campaign there.
The British had promised to support Greece. But on April 6th, Hitler sent his troops into Yugoslavia and Greece in support of his ally. And by April 27th, Greece surrendered. Hitler's dalliance in Greece had cost the delay of his push to the east, the campaign for which Hitler had gone to war. But he was not going to wait any longer. This struggle, Hitler told his commanders in 1941, is one of ideologies and racial differences, and will have to be conducted with unprecedented, merciless, and unrelenting harshness. Our Mississippi must be the Volga, Hitler said in the autumn of 1941, revealing the invasion of the Soviet Union to be a war of conquest, modeled on Hitler's favorite movie genre, the Western. But it would be a different type of war, Hitler promised. It would be Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. Hitler wanted to flatten Moscow and Leningrad, and he wanted it to be epic. At a Wehrmacht planning conference in Berlin on March 30th, 1941, Hitler told 200 of his senior commanders, "We have the chance to smash Russia while our back is free. I would be betraying the future of the German people if I did not seize it now." Meanwhile, Stalin received over 80 warnings about the invasion, Operation Barbarossa. He disregarded all of them.
We know the Soviet Union received all sorts of very specific information on Barbarossa when the invasion was going to take place, and Stalin ignored it. There is a part of the literature that kind of goes, well, Stalin was an idiot that he ignored this. And yet, as we look closer at the archives, at more recently published memoirs, we see that Stalin received all sorts of intelligence, some of which said, this is not going to happen at all.
But on June 22nd, a forward position radioed, "We are being fired on. What are we to do?"
After winning against France, the German leadership became megalomaniac and thought they can win against everybody on this planet. And this led them also to try to fight against the Soviet Union. They said, well, in the First World War, the Imperial German Army tried for 4.5 years to win against the French and did not manage, but they won against Russia.
With the failure of the Battle of Britain still fresh, Hitler began a two-front war. Operation Barbarossa's objective? The AA line from Archangel to Astrakhan. Approximately 2,700 kilometers long. The length was the equivalent of Paris to Istanbul, and Nizhny Novgorod, then known as Gorky, sits in the middle of the line. More than 2,000 kilometers from Berlin. 151 German divisions, supported by 40 from Axis partners, launched on a north-south front towards that objective in 3 thrusts, aimed initially for Leningrad, Kiev, and Smolensk. The battle zone was 20 times larger than for the Blitzkrieg of 1940, but this time they had only 10% more men and 30% more tanks.
When you look at the geography of the Soviet Union, when the Germans start, the Soviet Union is opening up like a funnel. But with each mile the Germans advance eastwards, this front becomes longer and overstretched. So the Germans have to cover a bigger space.
No European nation is able to win against the Russians with the vast resources, the enormous territory, and the huge number of people. Russia can only be defeated by its own internal disunity.
At 4:15 a.m. on June 22nd, German bombers struck 66 Soviet aerodromes, hitting much of their air force on the ground. By the end of the day, more than 1,000 Soviet aircraft had been destroyed. Whatever the outcome, this was the war's turning point. Victory would have made the Third Reich almost unassailable. Defeat would be written in history. "We must win, and quickly," Goebbels wrote in his diary. The public mood is one of slight depression. That day, Hitler left Berlin for his Rastenburg headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, Wolfschanze. By June 27th, German tanks had linked up east of Minsk. And a day later, the city surrendered.
And Stalin insisted on huge counterattacks that ended with Soviet troops being encircled by the Nazis and the loss of huge numbers of soldiers and territories.
Minsk was the first vivid revelation of the contrast to the fall of France. The conduct of the Russian troops in retreat was strikingly different, observed General Gunther Blumentritt. Even when they are surrounded, they do not leave their positions. The numbers of those captured at Minsk and the other encirclements are astonishing. But the delay caused by their stubborn resistance spoke volumes.
They totally underestimated the Soviet Union and the Red Army.
Of Soviet troops captured and kept as prisoners of war, 57.5% died in captivity. The death toll for British and American prisoners of the Germans was 3.5%. The war in the East was a different kind of war, and a more brutal one at that. By December, the Sixth Army could account, according to its own reporting, for several thousand publicly hanged or shot. But the success of Barbarossa could not be denied. And it pushed the German front line so quickly and so completely into the depths of European Russia. Hitler's plan to crush the Soviet Union was working, albeit with some resistance from its people. But German success brought more tragedy. With huge swathes of the Soviet Union now in German hands, 65 million more people were exposed to a fanatical regime. The Holocaust of bullets was in full force.
Commanders across the Eastern Front implemented these criminal orders. But it's not just the direct perpetration of criminal acts by the army, it's also their complicity in operating with the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen are the SS killers who ultimately, although not initially, receive orders to annihilate all Soviet Jews. Men, women, children, day after day, village after village, mass murder.
As early as June 24th, the shooting of Jews had begun. 201 in Gargstay, 214 in Kretinga on the 25th, 111 in Palanga on the 27th, escalating to the killing of 30,000 Jews at Kaunas.
Nazi Germany wanted to defeat the archenemy, the Bolshevik regime. And also, Nazi ideology wanted to win living space in Eastern Europe. And this meant that Germany wanted to extinguish large parts of the local population in the Soviet Union.
On June 28th, Hitler predicted that in 4 weeks, Moscow will be razed to the ground, and began to speak of other grand plans. An advance into Afghanistan, occupation of the oil-rich Middle East, with a view to the Nile and the Euphrates. it seems he never properly understood the war in terms of scale and distance. Following the early success of Barbarossa, one sobering fact remained. 97% of the Soviet Union was still unoccupied.
And so the factor of space, or the element of space, becomes quite crucial for the Germans, because they cannot control these large areas, large spaces that they had just conquered.
And though Stalin may have stumbled initially with Operation Barbarossa, it was far from over. And as far as the Soviets were concerned, he was still the man for the job.
They came to him and insisted that he should be at the head of the war effort was, I think, something of a relief for Stalin in those first days and weeks of the Operation Barbarossa.
On July 3rd, Stalin broadcast to the Soviet Union for the first time since the invasion. Stalin told those listening to fight. He addressed them as brothers and sisters, and did not invoke loyalty to the party or the Soviet state, but to Mother Russia. Stalin's star was on the rise. On July 8th, Goebbels wrote, "No one doubts anymore our victory in Russia." But by July 20th, there was reason to believe that the Russian campaign was not going by the book. Goebbels wrote, "It is clear that we have underestimated Bolshevism."
And the other thing is, if you're going to invade the Soviet Union, do you do it at the end of June? No, because you will burst forward into the Soviet Union and then get bogged down in the winter.
As the campaign dragged on, the invaders had killed or captured a number equal to that of their own invading force. But there were always more and more Soviet troops coming towards them. The Germans were almost within sight of the Kremlin, but Operation Barbarossa had failed. Back in 1940, Hitler had called on the German armed forces to crush Soviet Russia in a rapid campaign. That had not happened. There was no Plan B. The launch of what was supposed to be the final assault, Operation Typhoon, was announced by Hitler in a radio broadcast on October 2nd, 1941.
Operation Typhoon belongs to the second phase of the German offensive. There was never supposed to be any fighting in the autumn of 1941, and yet the absence of a Soviet defeat has produced the need for a new phase of operations.
By October 17th, Typhoon had netted a further 700,000 prisoners. Despite the rains, the 3rd and 4th Panzer armies had reached the Moscow-Volga Canal, less than 20 kilometers from the Kremlin.
And Stalin learned through bitter experience to listen to his generals, to accept their expertise, to take credit for victories, but to listen to his generals. So Stalin became, I think, a better military leader by staying out of it rather more towards the end than he had at the beginning.
Stalin stepping back meant Soviet General Georgy Zhukov could rise to the occasion. On December 5th, he launched his unexpected counteroffensive.
What the Germans are underestimating is the ability for the Soviets to raise reserves. They have a remarkable capacity for force generation. Something like 14 million men are available to the Soviets as cadres, men who have already served in the Soviet army and now can be recalled to the colors.
Behind the defensive line, assembling for the counterblow, had been 59 infantry divisions and 17 cavalry divisions, of whose existence the Germans were unaware. By December 6th, the Germans had gone onto the defensive along their entire front. And Zhukov had placed before the eyes of the world a spectacle it had never before witnessed: the mass surrender of German troops.
It turned out that the Red Army was determined to fight, and that the Soviet people were also determined to defend their home country. The Germans did not offer the Soviet people a new perspective, a new political perspective anyway.
A tremendous victory was won. But with the world distracted by the war in Europe, no one was keeping an eye on Japan. And only one day later, the Empire of Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The war in the Pacific was about to begin, and Hitler celebrated. He told his generals, "Now it is impossible for us to lose."